This content is on social attribution, or the explanations we give for our behavior and the behavior of others. So just to read you the theory to start with. So we are motivated to understand the causes of behavior. Attribution theory seeks to explain how and why we make these attributions. So imagine these kinds of things, attributions about others' behavior. So your child has a bad day at school and doesn't listen. You're interested right away in understanding why, what's going on. Your spouse brings you a gift for no special reason. Once again, your mind is asking, why? What was the motivation for this? Your best friend stops calling you and doesn't answer texts, which I am told is called ghosting. Why? Your mind wants to know. You're curious and interested in this. And we also make attributions about our own behavior. So imagine if you don't get hired for the job you wanted. Or imagine this one, you get an A on a hard exam. How do you explain this to yourself? You earned it? You miss an appointment because you oversleep. How do you explain this? Are you berating yourself and considering it to be a flaw within yourself? Or are you saying, oh, I was up so late last night studying and the baby kept me up? So this is the kind of thing we're looking at. So causal attributions are linking an event to a cause. So we might be, in the example I just gave about lateness, we might be inferring that a personality trait is responsible for a behavior. So in that case, that would be called a dispositional attribution, like something's wrong with this child. So the first example is this child turning in an assignment late and the teacher saying, so late, this child is lazy. This teacher has just made a dispositional attribution. Something's wrong with this child. And in this example, the child turns in the late assignment and the teacher says, so late, there may be a family issue. And in this case, he blames it on a situation. This child must be facing something difficult. And you can imagine the difference in the way he would treat the child depending on the attribution he makes. And so these attributions are important. And so in the one case, he's operating perhaps with compassion for the child. And in the other case, he's blaming the child and maybe forming a bad opinion of the child that will persist. So these long things are different scenarios. I might have phased them in. So imagine scenario A. There's a stimulus. A text from a friend says, sorry, I know we had plans, but I can't make it tonight, with this little sad face. Your attribution. You think, she must not be feeling well. And because of your attribution, your response is, okay, take good care of yourself and we'll get together another time. So you have this kind response. Now consider scenario B with the same stimulus, the text from the friend, sorry, I know we had plans, but I can't make it tonight, with the sad face. Now your attribution is, she must not like me anymore. And in that case, your response is, whatever, fine. And then you go home and brood about your awful social life. So you've probably made two people feel badly with this attribution, yourself and your friend. And so let's look at scenario C. Sorry, I know we had plans, but I can't make it tonight. And you think, she's such an undependable person, cripes. And you reply, cripes, you're always canceling at the last minute. What is wrong with you? And so in this case, you haven't blamed yourself as you did in example 2, but you've created a trait and put it on your friend, finding probably in your own mind examples of times when she's been undependable, and now attributing a stable personality trait that's inside of her to her actions, and then you're responding differently too. So you can see here the difference in these three attributions and what a difference they make in your friendship or in your response and in the subsequent friendship. In the first case, you're making an external attribution. She has an illness. This is not stable. She will recover. In the second case, you're kind of blaming yourself. I must have done something wrong, and then both of you are feeling bad. And in the third case, you're blaming her and attributing her with a trait characteristic. So how do we explain behavior? Well, we always have to infer causes because we can't get into someone else's head. And so these attributions have 3 dimensions. First off, we can have internal or external. And we just ask, is the cause inside me, or the person you're making the attribution for, or outside of me? All right. And so these are also called personal and impersonal in your book. And so I don't remember if I have an example here, so we'll see if it comes up. But if you're looking at the example of your child having a bad day at school and not listening, you could make an internal attribution and say this child is just a bad egg, a bad seed, something wrong with him. Or you could say, this child might have something bothering him at school, and talk to him about what is going on. And similarly, if you're making an attribution about yourself, if you are late for an appointment, an internal attribution would be to say, I'm such a loser. I never am on time. There's something wrong with me. There's an internal attribution. Or maybe it's outside of you. I am late because of the baby. The second dimension is stable versus unstable. Will this cause always be present, or will it change? And in the second example that we gave on the previous page of your friend canceling on you in the last minute, if you are attributing it to her sickness, that's an unstable attribution. It will change. But if you're attributing it to something to her personality trait of undependability, that's something that you assume will remain the same. And a better way, I think, to phrase these are permanent versus temporary. This unstable has a bad connotation, but it's actually a good thing. And so a temporary situation is your friend's illness. A permanent situation is her undependability, which you, in that attribution, think unlikely to change. And then the third dimension is global versus specific. Does this cause affect everything, global, or is it a unique event, specific? So in the example of the friend in the previous slide, does this cause affect everything? The cause is her undependability. Does it affect everything in her life? If so, that would be a global attribution. She's undependable not just in making arrangements with you, but in making arrangements with other people and in other responsibilities. That's global. Or is this a unique sort of situation? She's only, late when it comes to these personal social plans. So that would be an example of a specific attribution. And once again, we have another way of dichotomizing these. Pervasive, it's saturating everything in her life. Versus local, it's just impacting her social life. So similarly, if you have the cause of she's sick, then, if her sickness is affecting everything, she is home in bed and missing all of her work, then that's global. But if this is the only thing it's affecting, then it's specific. And we look at pervasive and local also. So just taking a quick look at that second attribution in the text message, she must not like me. That is an attribution on yourself. So it's an internal attribution on you. She canceled dinner because there's something wrong with me. And so that's an internal attribution, not for her behavior, but for something about you. I would say that's more characterized as a personal attribution. And so you can think about how you would explain these. Would you be making internal or external attributions, permanent or temporary attributions, pervasive or local, and how do those affect your responses? So we may blame ourselves, things that happen in our lives on factors inside of ourselves or outside of ourselves. and this should say external, not specific. So I'm going to fix that in the slide. So example, you rear-ended the car in front of you while you were driving home from work. So an internal attribution, both of these, I was pretty careless, or I was tired after a long day at work. And so here's a nice internal attribute, both internal. One of these would be more harmful than the other though, and we'll look at the implications of that in this and in next week's content. An external attribution would be, these tires are getting old and could not handle the rainy conditions. That's external. It's not in me, it's the car. Or that car ahead of me stopped so suddenly. Another external attribution. So that's the idea. Are you putting this inside yourself or outside yourself? And the nature of these internal and external attributions also matter. So global versus specific, or we also talked about the pervasive versus local. So we might blame things that happen in our lives and factors that are broad and far-reaching, global. COVID would be an example of that, or limited to an individual situation, specific. So you rear-ended the car in front of you when you were driving home from work. A global attribution is, I am a really lousy driver. It's global because it has implications for all of your driving. Specific, I wasn't paying enough attention because I was preoccupied with the boss said at the end of the day, and that means it's just this situation, okay? Just another example, I said COVID at the start of this, so a global attribution would be COVID and all the things that impacted, like if you're feeling depressed and you say, this is, it has to do with COVID. It's affecting everything in the world, and so it's less specific to just you. And then the stable versus unstable, or I really do like temporary versus permanent better than these terms. But we may blame things that happen in our lives on factors that are permanent and can't be changed. They're stable factors. Or they're temporary, changing situations. They're unstable. So same example, you rear-ended the car in front of you when you were driving home from work. Stable attribution has this kind of, it's never going to change feeling to it. I have never been good in rainy conditions, and here's one more example. And so there you're making a stable attribution, and maybe eventually you're going to just stop driving in wet conditions because you have attributed this kind of thing to your own stable skill. An unstable attribution says, I am unaccustomed to driving in these conditions and had better learn some skills. So this is unstable. It's temporary and changeable, and you're giving yourself the opportunity to improve. So one more example. You break up with a romantic partner. Everyone experienced this. Very few people don't experience this at some point in their lives. And one pattern that can have a kind of a lousy outcome is to make a stable attribution. I'll never get over this. This pain will always be with me. There's something wrong with me. Probably I'll never have another relationship. It's global. Without my partner, I can't seem to do anything right. It affects every part of my life. And it's internal. This was my fault. I'm undesirable. There's something wrong with me. You can see how this pattern of attributions could lead to depression. And that is a trigger. Breakups are a trigger for the onset of depression in vulnerable people. On the other hand, if you change your attributions and you say, this is hard. This is really hard. I'm feeling pain, but I'll get through this. You know that you've experienced pain in the past and you've gotten through it, and you know that it'll pass. Specific. I miss my partner, but I have other family and friends. So you're not just focused on this one person. Now you're thinking of, this person is gone, but you have other people. And external. It takes two to make a relationship work, and it wasn't meant to be. And so there again, you're not blaming the partner, but you're also not taking all the responsibility on yourself. And this will lead to a much better successful coping style and less likelihood of depression. So we get into habits of the way we explain things, and the person's habitual way of explaining things that happen is that person's explanatory style. And so some people are optimists in that they tend to make attributions that favor their own best outcome. And others are pessimists and tend to make attributions that don't favor their own best outcome. A lot of self-blame, failure to recognize temporary bad states, not taking credit for successes. And so these have different outcomes, and these are some of those outcomes. So the pessimistic style tends to have, and here we're using that word permanent rather than stable. This will last forever. It's pervasive, and this word pervasive instead of global. This will undermine everything, personal, internal, it's all my fault, and adding one more dimension, controllability. There's nothing I can do about it. It's out of my control. And that's a tendency toward the pessimistic style, especially for negative events. The optimistic style, if there's a bad thing happening, it'll pass. It's just this one situation. It's not really all my fault, and there's something I can do about it. And we're going to talk a little more in our next content next week about this controllability factor. And you can see, again, this pessimistic versus optimistic style in this romantic breakup that we just looked at. So negative events, optimists and pessimists explain things differently. So a pessimist, if they have a bad thing, like they get a bad grade on the test, they tend to think that it's permanent. I'll never get another good grade. Nothing in my life ever works out. It's global and it's internal. I'm not smart enough to get a good grade. So it's personal. Whereas the optimists for a bad thing tend to say it's temporary. At least it was just the one test. Specific math class has been tough this year. And external, my teacher should help me after school. And that also is a little bit of control there too. Maybe this person will go and seek help. We also see differences in explanations for positive events between these two groups of people. But I'm going to offer you to talk about optimism bias and watch this talk. It's only 17 minutes with Dr. Tali Ch05. She's a much more engaging lecturer than I am. And so take a look at this, and this is content that I'm looking at with you also. So I can't show this to you within this slideshow, but you can watch it via the link provided. So just a little more, do boys and girls explain things differently? And so we'll think a little bit about controllability, which is an individual's attribution style that has a powerful effect on his or her long-term outcomes. So believing you can't control things leads to reduced effort and increased failure. And so to this question, do boys and girls explain things differently? Yes. Research shows that boys are more likely than girls to attribute their failures to lack of effort, and girls are more likely than boys to attribute their failures to lack of ability. So I'm going to leave this question here, why might this be, and ask another. Do low and high SES people explain things differently? And by SES, we mean it's a shortened version, an acronym for socioeconomic status, referring to a combination of factors like employment, education, wealth, and that sort of thing. People with low SES tend to attribute successes with external factors like luck. So poorer people, oh, I was successful, I got lucky. And higher SES people tend to attribute success to internal factors like ability. I earned it. I'm that good. And in the opposite way, how about failures? People with low SES tend to attribute failures to internal factors, like I'm not good enough. And people with high SES tend to attribute failures to external factors, like, oh, that was unfair. The teacher was unfair. And so this little illustration here just looks at how you perceive your social class. And if you're middle class, you know, you have more choice, more opportunity to self-express compared to working class who are constrained and sensitive to threat. And so that gives these middle class people higher sense of perceived control, independence, self-focus, and then they can make dispositional attributions toward other people, blaming other people for their own lack of success and having low empathy for others. Prejudiced in response to threat. And on the other hand, people in the working class who have less control and are more constrained in our society have more interdependence. They rely more on other people. They focus more on the needs of others. They tend to make situational attributions for others' mistakes. This person blundered because they have a problem at home, and high empathy for others. And their judgment would be prejudiced in this way because of this chronic threat they have to stick together. And again, it's a matter of control. How much control do you have? If you believe you have a lot of control, then you tend to think you deserve that control. You tend to focus on yourself. You tend to blame others for their own problems and have this low empathy, all because you have this control and you assume everybody does. Whereas if you feel you don't have control, this comes to an entirely different way of engaging in the world. You're always threatened, so you pull together. You've had bad situations, so you recognize that others do as well. And so this is an ideological difference that comes out, and it is at the root of inequality, and it also explains how we come to have different attributional styles by socioeconomic status. So the common factor is control. I asked you about boys and girls. Historically, women have had less control over their own situations than men. This leads to attribution habits that are not optimal for their success, blaming themselves for their own failures. And those same attribution habits of women tend to empower men in believing they deserve their success and there's something wrong with women. Likewise, excuse me, people in low socioeconomic classes have less wealth and power than high SES, leading to attribution habits that reflect this lack of confidence in their own worth, and further empowering high SES people to believe that they deserve their success and there's something wrong with the others. Think about minority people. What is the impact for minority people who have a history of suppression, like Native peoples? Do you observe different attribution habits in yourself and others that might reflect this pattern? So a question that I'll leave you with, and you can continue with the next little lecture. Thanks for tuning in.